Right as I was getting my college acceptance, my stepfather slammed my laptop closed and said, "You won't amount to anything without me." The admissions officer went silent. My family laughed, thinking they just humiliated me. What they didn't know. The call was still connected. And the dean's voice, calm but cutting, delivered 12 words that wiped the smug smile off my stepfather's face and changed the entire trajectory of my life. The screen had gone black when Dennis's hand came down on it, but the green light on my webcam was still glowing, still active, still transmitting everything happening in our living room to Stanford University's admissions office, 1,500 miles away. I could see the realization dawning on Dennis's face as a woman's voice emerged from my laptop speakers, calm and professional, but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "Mr. Garrett, this is Dean Patricia Holbrook from Stanford University. I've just witnessed what appears to be domestic abuse of a prospective student during an official admissions call." I'd watched my stepfather's face go from smug satisfaction to confusion to something close to panic as he'd processed those words. My mother and step-siblings had fallen silent mid-laugh, their celebration of my humiliation dying in their throats. My younger stepbrother, Corey, who'd been filming the whole thing on his phone, thinking he was capturing my failure, had frozen with his camera still pointed at me. And I'd sat there in my chair, my hands shaking, but my voice steady, and said the only thing I could think to say, "Dean Holbrook, thank you for calling. I apologize for the interruption. As you can see, my home situation is complicated. I've been living with Dennis Hart and his family for 3 years, ever since my mother had married him when I was 15. Before that, it had been just Mom and me, struggling but happy in our small apartment in Sacramento. My father had died when I was 7, a construction accident that had left us with barely enough life insurance to cover the funeral. Mom had worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and I'd grown up understanding that education was my ticket to a better life. She'd always encouraged my academic work, had been proud when I'd tested into the honors program at my high school, had supported my dreams of going to a top university. Then she'd met Dennis at her job managing a medical office, and everything had changed. Dennis had seemed charming at first, the kind of guy who knew how to present well in public. He was a pharmaceutical sales rep with a good salary, a nice house in the suburbs, and 2 kids from a previous marriage. He'd swept my mother off her feet with dinners at expensive restaurants and weekend trips to Napa. When they'd gotten engaged after 6 months, Mom had been ecstatic. "We were moving up in the world," she'd said, "finally getting the stability we deserved." I'd been cautiously optimistic, hoping that maybe having a father figure would be good for me, that maybe this blended family thing could work. The reality had been different. Dennis's nice guy persona had lasted about 3 months after the wedding, just long enough for Mom to be legally bound to him and for us to have moved into his house. Then the criticism had started. Small things at first. Comments about how I didn't know how to properly mow the lawn, how I was too quiet at family dinners, how my interests in science and math were nerdy and antisocial. He'd started comparing me unfavorably to his own kids, Corey, who was a year younger than me and played football, and his daughter, Brianna, who was my age and was popular and social. "Your stepbrother knows how to be a man," Dennis would say when I'd spend Saturday afternoons studying instead of watching sports with him. "Your stepsister knows how to have friends and be normal. Why can't you be more like them?" Mom had initially tried to defend me, but Dennis had a way of making her feel guilty for having raised me wrong as a single mother. He'd positioned himself as the corrective force I needed, the masculine influence that would turn me from a bookish loser into a real man. And gradually, exhaustingly, Mom had started to buy into his narrative. She'd started suggesting I spend less time on homework and more time on sports. She'd questioned whether I really needed to take all those AP classes. She'd hinted that maybe Dennis had a point about me being too focused on academic achievement at the expense of social development. The situation had escalated during my junior year when I'd started seriously researching colleges. I'd been aiming high, looking at Stanford, MIT, Caltech, schools with excellent programs in biomedical engineering, which was my passion. I'd been inspired by my father's death, had spent years reading about construction safety, and had gradually shifted that interest into medical devices and prosthetics, ways that engineering could save lives and improve outcomes. My grades were excellent, 4.0 GPA, top 5% of my class. My test scores were strong, 1540 on the SAT, 35 on the ACT. I'd been building a research project about pressure sensors for prosthetic limbs, working with a professor at Sacramento State who'd let me use his lab. I'd had good extracurriculars, president of the Science Olympiad team, volunteer work at a rehabilitation center. My applications had been competitive, and I'd allowed myself to hope. But Dennis had made it clear that he thought my college plans were ridiculous and ungrateful. "You think you're too good for a community college?" he'd said when I'd mentioned Stanford. You think you're better than everyone else? Let me tell you something, kid. You're not special. You're not going to get into those schools. And even if you did, we're not paying for it. You want to go to college? You go to Sacramento City College like a normal person and you live at home and contribute to this household. You're 18 in 4 months, and then you're an adult and adults pay their own way. I'd applied anyway, secretly using fee waivers and submitting my applications from the school library where Dennis couldn't monitor my computer usage. He'd started restricting my internet access at home, claiming I was wasting time online when I should be doing chores or spending time with the family. He'd also started sabotaging my academic work in small ways, hiding my textbooks, unplugging my alarm clock so I'd wake up late and miss early morning study sessions, telling my mother that I was being disrespectful when I'd ask for quiet time to work on projects. The environment had become hostile in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. I'd started spending more time at school, arriving early and staying late, using my teachers' classrooms as refuge. My physics teacher, Dr. Leonard Ashford, had been particularly supportive. He'd noticed the change in my demeanor, had asked if everything was okay at home. I'd been vague, not wanting to admit how bad things had gotten, but Dr. Ashford had seemed to understand. He'd given me a key to his classroom so I could work there after school, had written one of my recommendation letters with language that had subtly indicated I was dealing with difficult circumstances. If you'd read between the lines, you could see he was trying to tell admissions committees that I was succeeding despite challenges at home. I'd been grateful for his discretion and his support. The college acceptance calls had started coming in March of my senior year. I'd been rejected from MIT and Caltech, which had stung, but hadn't been unexpected given how competitive those schools were. But I'd gotten into UC Berkeley with a partial scholarship, and I'd been waitlisted at Stanford with a note that I should expect a final decision by mid-April. I'd been thrilled about Berkeley, had started imagining myself studying in the Bay Area, far enough from Sacramento to have independence, but close enough to visit Mom if I needed to. But when I told my family about the acceptance, Dennis's reaction had been explosive. "You're not going," he'd said flatly. "We're not paying tens of thousands of dollars for you to go party at Berkeley when you could get the same education here. You're staying home, and that's final." Mom had backed him up, saying they'd discussed it and decided that financially it didn't make sense. I tried to explain that I had scholarships and could take out loans, that I'd work to cover the remaining costs, but Dennis had shut me down. "You're not going into debt for some liberal arts education," he'd said. "You want to make something of yourself, learn a trade, get a real job? This college obsession is over. You're done." I'd been devastated, but I'd also started planning. I was 18, would graduate in 2 months, and legally they couldn't force me to stay. I'd started working with my school's college counselor, Mrs. Deborah Kingston, who had 23 years of experience helping students navigate difficult family situations around college attendance. She'd helped me understand my options for financial aid, for student loans, for work-study programs. She'd also gently suggested that I might want to document some of what was happening at home, just in case I needed evidence later of why I required independence from my family for financial aid purposes. I'd started keeping a journal, writing down incidents of Dennis's verbal abuse, his attempts to sabotage my schoolwork, his explicit statements that he wouldn't support my education. I'd also started saving money from my part-time job at a coffee shop, hiding cash in a backpack I kept in my school locker. I'd been preparing to leave, to attend Berkeley with or without their blessing, to build a life separate from the toxicity of Dennis's household. And then Stanford had called. The call had come on a Saturday afternoon in mid-April, 3 weeks after my Berkeley acceptance. I'd been doing chores, cleaning the garage as Dennis had demanded, when my phone had rung. Unknown number. 650 area code. I'd answered and heard a professional woman's voice introduce herself as Lauren Vasquez from Stanford's Office of Undergraduate Admissions. She'd asked if I had time for a video call to discuss my application status. I'd been stunned, had said yes immediately, had rushed to my laptop, which was in my room, but Dennis had been home, had heard me running up the stairs, had followed me with that suspicious expression he always wore when he thought I was doing something he hadn't approved. I'd been setting up the video call on Zoom, my heart racing with hope and anxiety when he'd walked into my room without knocking. "What are you doing?" he demanded. I tried to explain, had said I had an important call about college, but he'd gotten that ugly look on his face that meant a confrontation was coming. "You're on my internet in my house using my electricity," he'd said. "I think I have a right to know what you're doing." He'd called down the stairs for Mom and Corey and Brianna to come up. Had said they should all hear this. The call had connected just as my family had crowded into my small bedroom, Lauren Vasquez's professional smile appearing on my screen. She'd started speaking, introducing herself more formally, explaining that she was calling to inform me that Stanford had made a final decision on my application. I'd been trying to focus on her words while Dennis had been breathing heavily behind me, while Corey had been smirking, while Mom had been looking uncomfortable but not leaving. Lauren had been building to the announcement, talking about the strength of my application, the quality of my research project, the recommendations from my teachers, and then she'd said the words I'd been desperately hoping to hear. "We are pleased to offer you admission to Stanford University's class of 2028 with a full financial aid package covering tuition, room, and board." I'd felt my whole body flood with relief and joy, had started to thank her, to express my gratitude. And that's when Dennis had slammed my laptop screen shut with both hands, the sharp crack echoing in the small room. The screen had gone black and Dennis had leaned close to my face, his breath hot and sour. "You'll never amount to anything without me," he'd said loud enough that I'd known Lauren could hear through the still active speakers if the call was still connected. "You're nothing. You understand? Nothing. Stanford can offer you whatever they want, but you're not going anywhere. You're going to stay here and learn what real life is about." And my mother and step-siblings had laughed. Actual laughter. Like Dennis had just delivered the punchline to a hilarious joke. Corey had filmed it on his phone. Brianna had giggled. Mom had smiled weakly like she was uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. And I'd sat there frozen, humiliated, crushed. That's when Dean Holbrook's voice had cut through the laughter, emerging from my laptop speakers with that calm authority. "Mr. Garrett, this is Dean Patricia Holbrook from Stanford University. I've just witnessed what appears to be domestic abuse of a prospective student during an official admissions call." The laughter had stopped instantly. Dennis had stepped back from my laptop like it was a snake. I'd opened the screen again and seen that the call was still very much connected, that Lauren Vasquez was still there, but now she'd been joined by an older woman with steel gray hair and an expression of controlled fury. Dean Holbrook had continued speaking, her voice professional, but carrying clear anger. "Miss Vasquez called me into this meeting when she heard the raised voices in the background," she'd said. "I've been listening for the past 3 minutes. Mr. Garrett, I assume you're the stepfather based on the context. What I've just witnessed is unacceptable. You physically struck this young man's computer during an official university call. You verbally abused him and you made explicit statements attempting to prevent him from accepting his admission to Stanford. I want to be very clear. This behavior constitutes abuse and I've asked our legal team to join this call to document what we've witnessed." She'd paused and another window had appeared on my screen showing a man in a suit sitting in what looked like an office. "This is Andrew Keller," he'd said, "Stanford's Associate General Counsel. I'm recording this call for documentation purposes. All parties should be aware that California is a two-party consent state for recordings, and by continuing to participate in this call, you're consenting to be recorded." Dennis had looked panicked, had started to say something, but Dean Holbrook had cut him off. "Mr. Garrett, I strongly suggest you leave this room immediately and allow us to speak with our admitted student privately." Dennis had looked at my mother, who'd been pale and shocked. The dean from Stanford had just threatened legal action, and Dennis had clearly not expected that his performance of paternal authority would have an audience of university officials and lawyers. Dennis had tried to recover, had attempted to sound reasonable. "Now wait a minute," he'd said. "You don't understand the situation here. This kid is ungrateful and disrespectful. I've been trying to teach him responsibility, and he thinks he's too good for this family. I have every right to set rules in my own home." Dean Holbrook's expression hadn't changed. "Mr. Garrett, Stanford University, has a legal obligation to ensure the safety and well-being of our admitted students. What we've witnessed on this call suggests that this young man is in an unsafe home environment. We have policies and resources to address situations exactly like this. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this room so we can speak with our student privately. If you refuse, I'll be contacting local authorities to conduct a welfare check." The threat had been clear and specific. Dennis had looked like he wanted to argue, but Andrew Keller had spoken up. "Mr. Garrett, I should inform you that we have clear video and audio evidence of you physically striking Mr. Cunningham's property and verbally abusing him. Under California Penal Code Section 273A, emotional abuse of a minor or dependent adult can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor or felony. While Mr. Cunningham is likely 18 at this point given his senior status, if he was 17 at the time of previous incidents, that statute could still apply. I'm not making accusations, just informing you of the legal framework we're operating within." Dennis's face had gone red, then white. He'd backed toward the door, had gestured angrily at Mom and the kids to leave with him. "We're not done here," he'd said to me. "You think Stanford is going to save you? You're still living in my house, and you'll follow my rules." They'd filed out and I'd heard Dennis slamming doors downstairs, heard him yelling at Mom about how I'd embarrassed the family. I'd been left alone in my room with my laptop and the 3 Stanford officials on the screen. I'd been shaking, adrenaline flooding my system, trying to process what had just happened. Dean Holbrook's expression had softened slightly. "Mr. Cunningham, I'm very sorry you had to experience that," she'd said. "But I want you to understand that Stanford takes the well-being of our students extremely seriously. We've just witnessed abusive behavior and we're going to take steps to ensure you're safe. Can you tell me, are you currently in danger? Do you feel safe in that house tonight?" I'd been honest, had told her that Dennis had never been physically violent toward me, but that the verbal abuse and emotional manipulation had been ongoing for years. I'd explained that I was 18, would graduate in 6 weeks, and had been planning to leave for college regardless of my family's opposition. Dean Holbrook had nodded. "Here's what's going to happen," she'd said. "First, we're documenting everything that occurred on this call. Second, we're going to have our student services team reach out to you within the next hour to discuss emergency housing options if you need to leave that home before graduation. Third, we're going to work with you to ensure your financial aid package is completely independent of your parents, which it sounds like it already is based on the full ride we offered. And fourth, we're going to connect you with resources to help you navigate the next 6 weeks safely. You are not alone in this. Stanford is committed to ensuring you can accept your admission and attend in the fall without interference from abusive family members." Lauren Vasquez had added her own assurance. "We have resources for students coming from difficult home situations," she'd said. "I'm going to email you information about our bridge program for admitted students who need support during the summer before matriculation. We can arrange for early move-in, summer housing, campus employment, whatever you need to make the transition safely." Andrew Keller had provided his contact information and had said that if Dennis attempted to prevent me from attending Stanford through any legal means, the university's legal team would intervene. "We've had cases where parents or guardians have tried to block students from accepting admissions," he'd said. "We have protocols to address that. You have rights as an adult to make your own educational choices and will help you assert those rights if necessary." The call had ended with concrete next steps, phone numbers and email addresses and assurances that I'd hear from someone within the hour. I'd closed my laptop and had sat in stunned silence trying to absorb that in the span of 15 minutes I'd been accepted to Stanford, publicly humiliated by my stepfather, and then defended by a dean and university counsel who'd witnessed the whole thing. The trajectory from crushing shame to institutional support had been dizzying. I'd heard Dennis still yelling downstairs. Had heard doors slamming. Had known a confrontation was coming, but I'd also known with sudden clarity that I had allies now. Stanford knew what was happening. They'd documented it. They'd offered help. Dennis's power over me had been broken the moment he'd slammed that laptop shut without realizing the call was still connected. Within 45 minutes, I'd received a call from Stanford's Office of Student Services. The woman on the phone had introduced herself as Dr. Monica Brennan, Director of Student Support Services with over 18 years of experience helping students navigate difficult family situations. She'd been warm but professional, had asked detailed questions about my current safety, my financial resources, my plans for the next 6 weeks until graduation. I'd explained about my part-time job, my savings, my plan to crash with friends if I needed to leave Dennis's house. Dr. Brennan had offered an alternative. "We have an emergency fund for admitted students facing housing insecurity," she'd said. "We can arrange for you to stay in temporary housing near your high school until graduation, either with a host family in our alumni network or in a short-term rental that we'd cover. We don't want you to have to couch surf or put yourself in vulnerable positions. Would you be open to that?" I'd been overwhelmed by the offer, had accepted gratefully. Within 2 hours, Dr. Brennan had connected me with a Stanford alumnus named Gregory Foster who lived in Sacramento and had a guest room he used for exactly these situations. Gregory had called me, had explained that he'd been a first-generation college student from a difficult family background himself, and that paying it forward by helping students like me was important to him. "You can stay here until you graduate and move to campus," he'd said. "No strings attached, no rent, just a safe place to live and study." I packed a bag that night while Dennis had been downstairs watching television, had written a note to my mother explaining that I was leaving and would not be returning, and had walked out of that house for the last time. My mother had called me the next morning, her voice strained. "Your stepfather is very upset," she'd said. "He thinks you overreacted to what happened yesterday. He says he was just trying to teach you a lesson about gratitude, and you made him look like a monster to Stanford. Michael, you need to come home and apologize. We can work this out." I'd been sitting in Gregory Foster's comfortable guest room eating breakfast he'd made and I'd felt something shift inside me. "No," I'd said. "I'm not apologizing. Dennis assaulted my property and verbally abused me during an official university call. Stanford documented it and they're treating it as what it is, which is abuse. I'm 18. I graduate in 6 weeks and I'm done living in that toxic environment. If you want a relationship with me going forward, you need to accept that I'm not coming back to that house and I'm not subjecting myself to Dennis's behavior anymore. My mother had started crying, had said I was tearing the family apart, that Dennis was just trying to be a father to me, and I was being selfish and ungrateful. I'd listened to her justifications and rationalizations, the same ones I'd been hearing for 3 years. And I'd realized that she'd chosen Dennis over me a long time ago. That hurt, but it also freed me from any obligation to maintain a relationship that was harming me. I'd told her I loved her, but I needed distance, and I'd ended the call. She'd tried calling back multiple times that day, but I'd let it go to voicemail. I'd needed space to process and grieve the family I'd thought I had. The next 6 weeks had been strange and liberating. I'd lived with Gregory Foster, who'd treated me like an adult and given me space to focus on finishing high school strong. I'd continued my job at the coffee shop, had saved every dollar I'd earned. Dr. Ashford had helped me coordinate with the school to ensure my transcripts and final grades would be sent directly to Stanford, bypassing any potential interference from Dennis or my mother. Mrs. Kingston had helped me fill out the final financial aid paperwork, documenting my independent status now that I'd left home. Stanford's financial aid office had been incredibly supportive, had worked with me to ensure my full ride was secure, and that I'd have stipend money for books and personal expenses. I'd graduated as valedictorian, had given a speech about resilience and the importance of seeking help when you're in difficult situations, and had pointedly not invited my mother or Dennis or step-siblings to attend. Dr. Ashford had been there along with Gregory Foster and Mrs. Kingston and several friends from school. That had been my family that day, the people who'd chosen to support me rather than tear me down. After graduation, Stanford had arranged for early move-in as promised. I'd arrived on campus in late June, 8 weeks before the regular freshman class, and had been placed in a summer program for students who needed extra support during the transition to college. There had been about 30 of us, all from difficult backgrounds, all navigating family estrangement or financial hardship or other challenges. We'd bonded over shared experiences and had formed a tight-knit community. By the time the regular freshmen had arrived in September, I'd already felt at home at Stanford, had already known my way around campus, had already connected with professors and resources. But the story of what Dennis had done during my acceptance call had taken on a life of its own. Dean Holbrook had apparently used it, with my permission, as a case study in a presentation she'd given at a national conference on college access and student support. She described the incident without using names, but had detailed how Stanford had responded and the resources they'd mobilized. The story had resonated with other colleges and universities who were dealing with similar situations of family obstruction of student success. An education journalist had picked up the story and had written an article for Inside Higher Ed about how universities were increasingly having to intervene in abusive family dynamics to protect admitted students. The article had gone viral in education circles and had led to conversations about institutional responsibility for student well-being starting before matriculation rather than waiting until students arrived on campus. My specific story had remained somewhat anonymous in these public discussions, but within Stanford's community, it had been well known. Administrators and faculty had known who I was, had gone out of their way to check in and offer support. That had been both helpful and occasionally overwhelming, being known as the student whose stepfather had been caught abusing him on a video call, but I'd learned to accept the notoriety as the price of the support I'd received. The story had also circulated among students who'd generally been supportive and had treated me with kindness rather than pity. My first year at Stanford had been academically challenging but emotionally healing. I'd thrived in the biomedical engineering program, had connected with professors doing research on prosthetics and medical devices, had joined labs and research groups. I'd made friends, had dated a little, had discovered parts of myself that had been suppressed in Dennis's household. I'd also started therapy through Stanford's counseling services, working with a therapist named Dr. Patricia Vega, who specialized in family estrangement and complex trauma. She'd helped me process the years of emotional abuse, the grief of losing my mother to Dennis's manipulation, the complicated feelings about being rescued by an institution in such a public way. I'd learned that what I'd experienced had a name, that psychological abuse and parental alienation were recognized forms of harm, that my reactions and choices had been healthy and appropriate. Dr. Vega had helped me understand that I didn't owe Dennis or my mother forgiveness or reconciliation, that I could choose to have no contact if that was what I needed for my mental health. That permission had been liberating. I'd spent 18 years being told I was ungrateful and difficult when actually I'd been responding normally to abnormal circumstances. understanding that had helped me rebuild my sense of self-worth. I'd also reconnected with some extended family on my father's side, relatives I hadn't seen much since his death. They'd heard through social media about my admission to Stanford and had reached out to congratulate me. I'd learned that Dennis had actively discouraged my mother from maintaining those relationships, had isolated her from people who might have questioned his treatment of me. Rebuilding those connections had given me a sense of family heritage and belonging that Dennis had tried to erase. Sophomore year had brought an unexpected development. Corey, my stepbrother, who'd filmed my humiliation during the Stanford call, had reached out via social media asking if we could talk. I'd been wary but curious, and we'd agreed to a video call. Corey had looked uncomfortable and guilty. "Look," he'd started. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day when Stanford called you. I was a dick. I laughed and I filmed it and I thought it was funny that Dad was putting you in your place. But I've been in therapy working through some stuff and my therapist asked me to watch that video I took." Michael, watching it back with some distance. "It wasn't funny. It was abuse. Dad was abusing you and we all went along with it because we thought that's what family loyalty meant. I'm sorry. I was 15 and stupid and I didn't understand what I was seeing. But I understand now and I'm sorry." I'd been surprised by the apology. Had asked what had prompted the change. Corey had explained that he'd started having his own conflicts with Dennis. That once I'd left and wasn't there to be the scapegoat, Dennis had turned his criticism toward Corey. He'd started experiencing the same belittling and manipulation I'd endured. That had led to Corey going to therapy, which had led to him recognizing the patterns of abuse in our household, which had led to him questioning everything he'd been taught about family dynamics. "I'm probably going to end up leaving, too," Corey had admitted. "Once I turn 18 and graduate, I think I need distance from Dad. Mom's never going to stand up to him, and Brianna is so deep in the golden child role that she doesn't see the problems, but I see them now, and I wanted to apologize to you before I leave." I'd accepted Corey's apology cautiously, and had offered to be a resource if he needed advice about navigating college applications or family estrangement. We'd stayed in touch occasionally after that, not close, but on civil terms. It had been a small piece of healing, knowing that at least one member of that household had recognized the truth. The legal consequences for Dennis had been less dramatic than I'd hoped, but still significant. Stanford's legal team had sent a formal letter to him and my mother, warning them that any attempt to interfere with my education or financial aid would be met with legal action. The letter had referenced the recorded video call and had made clear that Stanford had documentation of abuse that could be provided to authorities if necessary. That threat had been enough to ensure Dennis backed off completely. He'd apparently been terrified that Stanford would release the video publicly or send it to his employer, which would have destroyed his reputation. He'd instructed my mother not to contact me, which she'd mostly respected, though she'd sent occasional emails begging me to reconsider cutting off contact. I'd read them, but rarely responded, maintaining boundaries that Dr. Vega had helped me establish. The marriage between my mother and Dennis had apparently deteriorated over the 2 years since I'd left, with Mom gradually realizing that Dennis's behavior toward me had been a preview of how he'd treat everyone once he felt secure in his control. They'd separated during my sophomore year and had divorced by the time I was a junior. Mom had reached out after the divorce, wanting to rebuild our relationship, and we'd started therapy together with a family counselor. That process had been difficult, working through her choices to enable Dennis's abuse and her failure to protect me. But she'd been genuinely remorseful and had done the hard work of accountability. We'd rebuilt a relationship slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries. She'd attended my Stanford graduation and had cried watching me receive my diploma. I think she'd finally understood what she'd almost cost me. The full impact of what had happened during that Stanford acceptance call had crystallized for me during junior year when I'd given a talk to incoming freshmen about navigating difficult family situations. Dean Holbrook had asked if I'd be willing to share my story and I'd agreed. I'd stood in front of 200 freshmen in Memorial Auditorium and had told them about Dennis slamming my laptop shut, about the dean's voice cutting through my family's laughter, about how Stanford had mobilized resources to protect me. I'd explained the importance of documenting abuse, of reaching out to trusted adults, of accepting help when institutions offered it. And I'd emphasized that getting to college wasn't the end of healing, but the beginning, that they'd need to do the work of therapy and boundary setting and identity reconstruction. The talk had been well received and had led to dozens of students reaching out to share their own stories of family obstruction and abuse. I'd realized that my experience wasn't unique, that many students were navigating similar dynamics, and that there was value in making these stories public so people understood the barriers some students faced. That realization had shifted my career goals slightly. I'd still pursued biomedical engineering, had still done research on prosthetic devices, but I'd also gotten involved in advocacy work around college access for students from difficult family backgrounds. I'd worked with Stanford's admissions office to develop better protocols for identifying and supporting these students during the application and transition process. I'd helped draft policies about institutional intervention in cases of documented family abuse. I'd become part of the solution to a problem I'd experienced firsthand. By the time I'd graduated from Stanford with my bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering, I'd accumulated more than just academic credentials. I'd built a chosen family of mentors, friends, and supporters who'd helped me become the person I'd always had the potential to be. I'd healed from years of emotional abuse and had developed a strong sense of my own worth independent of Dennis's attempts to diminish me. I'd maintained my academic excellence while also learning to prioritize my mental health and well-being. And I'd turned my painful experience into advocacy that was helping other students. The day I'd walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about that moment 3 years earlier when Dennis had slammed my laptop shut, thinking he was crushing my dreams. He'd had no idea that the call was still connected, that his abuse was being witnessed and documented, that institutions had power to intervene and protect. His moment of cruel triumph had become the catalyst for my liberation. Dean Holbrook had attended my graduation and had congratulated me afterward. "I've watched you thrive these 4 years," she'd said. "And I'm so proud of what you've accomplished despite the obstacles you faced. But I'm most proud that you've used your experience to help others. That's what makes you truly exceptional, not your grades or your research, though those are impressive. It's your character and your commitment to making sure other students don't have to face what you faced alone." Those words had meant more to me than the diploma itself. 5 years after that acceptance call, I'd started my PhD program at MIT in biomedical engineering, working on neural interfaces for advanced prosthetics. I'd received multiple fellowship offers and had chosen MIT because of their research facilities and faculty expertise. The financial security Stanford had provided had allowed me to pursue graduate school without debt, without dependence on family support, without the constraints that had limited my mother's generation. I'd published papers, presented at conferences, built a reputation in my field. I'd also maintained my advocacy work, serving on advisory boards for organizations focused on college access and student support services. I'd given talks at universities around the country about institutional responsibility for student well-being and about recognizing and responding to family abuse. The story of Dennis slamming my laptop shut during my Stanford acceptance call had become a cautionary tale in higher education circles. An example of why universities needed to be prepared to intervene when they witnessed abuse. Some institutions had updated their policies because of what had happened to me, had trained their admissions staff to recognize signs of family obstruction, had created protocols for emergency student support. That systemic change felt like the most meaningful outcome of my experience. My pain had been transformed into protection for others. That felt like justice in a way that Dennis facing legal consequences never could have achieved. I'd also developed a relationship with Gregory Foster that had evolved from emergency housing host to mentor to friend. He'd supported me through my 4 years at Stanford and had celebrated every achievement. He'd introduced me to his network of Stanford alumni and had helped me navigate professional opportunities. When I told him I was heading to MIT for my PhD, he'd been genuinely proud, had said watching me succeed had been one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. "You remind me of why I do this work," he'd said. "Why I keep that guest room available for students who need it. Every young person deserves a chance to pursue their potential without being sabotaged by the people who are supposed to support them. You took that chance and you've built something remarkable. Keep going, keep advocating, keep being proof that intervention works and that students can heal and thrive." I'd taken his words to heart and had committed to maintaining my own version of that guest room. Once I was established in my career, I'd pay forward the support I'd received by supporting the next generation of students facing similar obstacles. That felt like honoring the people who'd rescued me, while also creating the kind of world where rescue wouldn't be as necessary because the abuse would be recognized and stopped earlier. The last time I'd thought about Dennis and that moment when he'd slammed my laptop shut had been during my PhD program when I'd been interviewed for an article in the Stanford Daily about student success stories. The journalist had asked me what moment had defined my college experience and eventual success. I'd told her about the acceptance call, about Dennis's attempt to humiliate and control me, about Dean Holbrook's intervention, and I'd said something that I'd been thinking about for years but hadn't articulated until that moment. The second most important thing that happened during that call was Stanford accepting me. The most important thing was that they witnessed who I was living with and they chose to act. Because acceptance to a university doesn't mean anything if you can't survive to get there. Stanford understood that and they protected me. That's why I succeeded. Not because I was smarter or more deserving than other students, but because when I was in crisis, an institution had the resources and the will to intervene. That's what changed everything. The article had run with the headline, "From Abuse to Advocacy, How Stanford's Intervention Saved One Student and Changed University Policy," and had been shared widely. I'd received messages from current students and prospective students and even some high school counselors thanking me for sharing my story. Several people had reached out to say that reading about my experience had given them courage to report their own family situations or to seek help from their schools. That ripple effect had validated my decision to be public about what had happened rather than keeping it private out of shame or embarrassment. 10 years after Dennis had slammed my laptop shut, I'd be defending my PhD dissertation at MIT and looking ahead to a postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins. I'd have job offers from major medical device companies and from university research labs. I'd have published 15 peer-reviewed papers and held 2 patents for prosthetic sensor technology. I'd be engaged to someone I met in graduate school, a fellow engineer who understood my passion for work, that helped people, and who supported my advocacy efforts. I'd have built a life that bore no resemblance to the one Dennis had tried to force me into. The one where I'd attend community college and live at home and learn my place. And sometimes I'd still think about that moment, the sound of my laptop screen slamming shut. Dennis's voice saying I'd never amount to anything without him. The laughter of my family. But now when I thought about it, I'd also hear Dean Holbrook's calm voice cutting through that laughter, establishing that what was happening was wrong and that help was available. I'd remember the feeling of being protected by an institution that had the power to intervene. And I'd remember making the choice to accept that help, to walk away from toxicity, to build something better. Dennis had been wrong about everything. I'd amounted to something precisely because I'd gotten away from him. His moment of cruel triumph had been the beginning of his loss of control over me. And the 12 words Dean Holbrook had spoken through my laptop speakers, the ones that had wiped the smile off his face, had been the beginning of my freedom. He'd never amount to anything without me, but I'd amounted to everything without him, and that was just as enough. Have you ever been in a situation where a single moment changed your entire trajectory? Or has an institution or unexpected ally stepped in to save you from a difficult family situation? Tell me your story in the comments below.